Under the vaulted ceilings of the grand hall, the air was heavy with ceremony. The gold-trimmed parchment lay on the oak table, its crisp edges reflecting the light of the ornate chandeliers above. Courtiers stood in hushed expectation. Journalists had their pens poised, and cameras hummed softly, their lenses trained on the historic moment about to unfold. King Charles sat at the head of the table, his expression a mask of regal composure. Beside him, Princess Anne maintained her characteristic steel-eyed focus, her posture unwavering. The royal decree was about to be signed, a document that, by tradition and precedent, would be a permanent fixture in the chronicles of the monarchy. But on this day, tradition would be jolted by a deliberate absence, a name missing from the words so carefully inscribed. That absence was Meghan Markle's. The omission wasn't announced in bold or spoken aloud. It didn't have to be. Those who had seen enough royal documents knew exactly where her name should have appeared, where it had appeared before. But instead, a blank space stood in its place, an invisible line drawn through her royal association. It was the kind of change you might miss if you weren't looking, but once seen, it was impossible to ignore. For those who understood the weight of royal decrees, this was not a clerical oversight or a harmless edit. It was a statement, one that reverberated quietly through the room, sending a ripple of tension from one corner to the next. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It's easy to imagine Meghan far from the marble floors of that chamber, perhaps in a California home bathed in warm afternoon light, checking her phone as the news alert pinged. At first glance, the headline might seem like another round of gossip, until she realized the document in question was real, official, and irreversible. The royal decree, carrying both the king's signature and Princess Anne's seal, was now a matter of public record. Her name, once there by right of marriage and title, had been removed entirely. For King Charles, this was no casual administrative choice. Every word in such a decree is scrutinized, drafted, and redrafted by advisors before it ever reaches his desk. Royal decrees are both legal instruments and symbolic gestures. They communicate power, recognition, and inclusion. By co-signing this document, Charles and Anne weren't merely agreeing to an amendment. They were aligning themselves publicly on a matter that touches the very core of the monarchy's unity. The decision's precision and timing suggest a clear intent to draw a boundary. Why now? That's the question hanging in the air, the one whispered in the corridors of power and debated on news panels. For months, tension between Meghan and certain senior royals had been no secret. Public interviews, memoir revelations, and perceived slights had worn down the fragile truce between the Sussexes and the rest of the family. But until now, the institution had largely avoided direct, irrevocable gestures of separation. This was different. This was written into history. Princess Anne's signature alongside Charles's was more than a formality. Known for her uncompromising approach to duty and her guarded skepticism toward celebrity culture, Anne's endorsement gave the move a weight that couldn't be dismissed as mere palace politics. For decades, she has been a stalwart defender of the monarchy's traditions, often shunning the limelight herself while quietly shaping internal decisions. Her presence here suggested that this wasn't just about Charles's personal feelings, it was a united front. For those present in the room, the atmosphere was deceptively calm. No voices were raised. No grand declarations were made. But the silence carried an edge, as if everyone was aware they were witnessing a turning point that would be dissected for years to come. Some aides exchanged glances, others avoided eye contact altogether. The signing itself was quick, almost routine. Charles placed his pen to the parchment, paused briefly, whether in thought or calculation was impossible to say, and then wrote his name in sweeping strokes. And followed, her penmanship sharp and deliberate. The document was lifted, sealed, and the moment was over. Officially, it was just another decree. Unofficially, it was the loudest statement the monarchy had made about Meghan in years. From a distance, the omission might seem like a mere matter of protocol. But within the monarchy, protocol is power. Names on a decree aren't just identifiers. They are acknowledgments of standing, legitimacy, and belonging. Removing a name isn't about ink and paper. It's about erasing a position from the royal narrative. It's a way of saying, without saying, that someone is no longer recognized as part of the institution's fabric. And in this case, that someone was a woman who had once stood before the world in a cathedral, welcomed into the royal fold as a duchess. For those who have followed the Sussex saga from the beginning, this moment carries layers of meaning. It's the culmination of years of strained relations, from the initial fairy tale romance to the increasingly public fractures in the family. Meghan and Harry's decision to step back from royal duties was one turning point, their televised interviews another. Each chapter added to the growing divide, and yet, for all the words spoken and books published, there remained an official thread connecting Meghan to the royal machine. Until now, public reaction was immediate. Within minutes of the signing, journalists and royal watchers were posting side-by-side images of past decrees and the new one, highlighting the gap where Meghan's name once appeared. Theories began to circulate. Was this a direct response to something recent? A strategic move to protect the monarchy's image? Or perhaps a preemptive step before a larger restructuring of roles and titles? On social media, hashtags began trending, some in support of Meghan, others praising the monarchy for drawing the line. The timing, too, raised eyebrows. This was not a quiet week in the news cycle. There were upcoming royal engagements, a charity gala where the king was expected to speak, and a series of Commonwealth visits being planned. By signing the decree now, Charles and ensured it would be the defining story overshadowing all else. Whether that was a calculated risk or an intentional diversion remains unclear, but it suggests the monarchy was prepared for the headlines. Behind closed doors, the decision likely sparked its own chain reaction. For Harry, the absence of his wife's name would have been both a professional and personal blow. Royal decrees are not easily altered once signed. They stand as historical documents, archived for future generations. This was not something that could be undone with a quiet conversation or a press release. It was permanent, and permanence in the monarchy is rare. For Meghan, the impact would be as much emotional as symbolic. She had navigated years of public criticism, much of it deeply personal, but being formally omitted from a royal decree struck at a different level. It wasn't just public opinion, it was institutional rejection. And while she may have publicly embraced her life beyond the palace gates, the reality of being erased from its official records would be difficult to ignore. Even for those who view the monarchy as outdated, the act carried significance. The British royal family operates as much on perception as on law. Every gesture, every omission, every subtle shift in language is noted and interpreted by those who follow its rhythms. This was one of those gestures, a calculated move that would inevitably shape narratives for months, if not years. And so, the story begins here, with a pen stroke in a gilded hall, a name left unsaid, and a monarchy that once welcomed Meghan now signaling, in its own reserved but unmistakable way, that she is no longer part of its written story. It is a moment that invites questions. What led to this decision? Who pushed for it behind the scenes? And perhaps most importantly, what does it mean for the future of the royal family, for Meghan, and for the ever-shifting boundary between personal grievance and public duty? If this moment feels small on paper, that's only because the paper hides the storm. The answers lie in the layers beneath. The private meetings, the whispered warnings, and the slow, deliberate steps that carried the monarchy to this exact point. And as we unravel those layers, the true weight of this omission will become clear. The history of Meghan's place in royal decrees begins long before this latest chapter of omission and quiet scandal. When she first entered the royal family, her name appeared in these formal documents as a matter of course, part of the tradition that recognized a member's role, position, and status. Royal decrees, often overlooked by the casual public, are deeply significant within the institution. They are not mere ceremonial niceties. They are the monarchy's official record, the ink and parchment affirmations of who stands where in the hierarchy. For Meghan, being included was, at first, an unspoken acknowledgement of her role as the Duchess of Sussex and the wife of Prince Harry. These decrees tied her to the fabric of the monarchy in a way no public statement or smiling photo op could fully replicate. The first time Meghan's name appeared in a royal decree was shortly after her wedding in 2018. The document pertained to a Commonwealth initiative that she and Harry were expected to support, alongside senior members of the family. Her name was placed with formality, alongside other working royals, carrying the weight of legitimacy. The Queen's signature adorned the page, and Meghan's inclusion was more than symbolic, it was functional. It told the world that she was not just Harry's wife, but a royal in her own right, with official duties and recognition. Inside palace walls, her name's placement reflected the optimism of those early months, a belief that she would embrace the unique responsibilities and traditions that came with her new role. In those days, there was still a sense of excitement surrounding her entry into the family. Decrees and official notices mentioning Meghan were released with fanfare, often accompanied by photographs of her smiling alongside the Queen or engaging with dignitaries. The public saw these as signs of a modern monarchy willing to evolve. Meghan was presented as a fresh face, a bridge between the traditional royal institution and a more diverse, contemporary Britain. Every document that bore her name reinforced that narrative. But as the months passed, small signs began to emerge that not all was well. In the early stages, these were subtle: a shift in how her title was listed, a slightly altered placement in the decree order. Protocol can be adjusted for a variety of reasons, and to the casual observer, such changes seemed inconsequential. Yet for those who understood the precision of royal language and documentation, these were quiet signals. Placement in a decree reflects not just one's rank, but the esteem in which one is held at a given moment. These shifts were, to the trained eye, a hint of evolving dynamics behind closed doors. The turning point began to form around the time Meghan and Harry publicly expressed their frustrations with royal life. Following their decision to step back from full-time duties in 2020, the decrees changed markedly. Where her name had once been alongside Harry's in the context of shared projects, it now appeared in more limited contexts, often with subtle qualifiers or reduced prominence. In some decrees, she was acknowledged only indirectly, referred to through Harry rather than in her own capacity. This was not yet exclusion, but it was a narrowing of her official footprint. There is a practical side to this evolution. When a royal steps back from official duties, their inclusion in certain decrees is no longer necessary. However, the monarchy has historically been flexible with such matters, particularly when there is a desire to maintain a united front. In Meghan's case, the adjustments seemed more pointed. They reflected not just a change in her working role, but a shift in the willingness of the institution to keep her name woven into its ceremonial fabric. The pattern became clearer when examining decrees from this period alongside those from earlier years. In 2019, Meghan's name was present in documents concerning patronages, charitable initiatives, and ceremonial roles. By late 2020 and into 2021, those mentions had dwindled, replaced by broader references to the Duke of Sussex or omitted entirely in areas where her participation had once been acknowledged. Analysts who study royal documents noted that the speed of this shift was unusual. While the monarchy often takes years to formally adjust public records to match internal changes, Meghan's reduction in visibility on paper was rapid. This history is essential to understanding the impact of the latest omission. It was not a sudden erasure without precedent, but rather the final step in a gradual process of distancing. Each change in wording over the past few years had been like a brushstroke, painting a picture that was only now fully visible. The early optimism of her role had been replaced by careful limitation, and those limitations had now reached their natural conclusion, her name no longer appearing in a decree where it once would have been automatically included. It's important to note that royal decrees carry more than ceremonial weight. They often outline duties, formal recognitions, and positions tied to the functioning of the monarchy. Inclusion in such a document is a way of signaling not only honor but relevance. When Meghan's name began to fade from these records, it suggested a deliberate choice to minimize her official relevance, whether for political, personal, or public relations reasons. Within the palace, these changes likely stirred their own undercurrents of discussion. Courtiers and advisors, tasked with drafting and revising such documents, would have debated the implications of each adjustment. Removing a name is not a casual act. It is considered, approved, and carried out with the understanding that it will be noticed by those who track royal affairs. It is a message as much as it is a bureaucratic action. Looking back, one can see that the history of Meghan's inclusion in royal decrees tells the broader story of her relationship with the monarchy itself. It began in warmth and welcome, with her presence enshrined in officialdom as part of the family's future. Over time, as tensions rose and choices were made on both sides, that presence diminished. By the time her name was removed entirely, it was less a shock to those watching closely and more the inevitable outcome of a trajectory that had been in motion for years. This first chapter of the story, then, is not simply about the recent removal. It is about the arc from inclusion to exclusion, the subtle stages by which a royal figure can be written out of the record without a single word of public condemnation. It is about how the institution communicates its stance not with speeches or headlines, but with the quiet precision of ink on parchment, each omission carrying a history of decisions and disagreements beneath its surface. The event that changed everything did not unfold in a dramatic televised showdown or a sudden royal proclamation. Instead, it began behind the heavy oak doors of a private meeting room in one of the monarchy's most secure residences, a room shielded from public view and press intrusion. It was an early winter afternoon, the kind of day where the outside air carries a sharp bite, and the palace interiors seemed to hold their own gravity. Inside, the air was warm but tense, a mix of polished wood, old stone, and the unspoken knowledge that something significant was about to be decided. The gathering was not the kind of meeting that appeared on any official schedule. It was discreet, invitation only, and comprised of those whose influence within the royal family was both deep and enduring. King Charles was there, seated at the head of the table, his expression betraying nothing but a measured seriousness. To his right sat Princess Anne, the embodiment of composure and unbending duty, her presence a signal that whatever was on the agenda would require not just approval, but firm enforcement. Around them were a select few senior aides and advisors, individuals who had weathered decades of palace politics and understood the weight of what was being discussed. On the table were several thick folders, each one filled with briefing notes, historical precedents, and legal implications. At the center was a draft of the upcoming royal decree. At first glance, the draft was unremarkable, just another formal document prepared for signature. But a closer look revealed the fault line. Meghan Markle's name, present in early iterations of the text, had been crossed out in ink that was still faintly smudged. The decision to remove it had already been made in principle. Now it was about finalizing that choice and locking it into the monarchy's records. Reports from those with knowledge of the meeting suggest that it was Princess Anne who spoke first. Her tone, as ever, was direct. There was no appetite for flowery language or softened edges. She laid out her perspective with the clarity of someone who has spent her entire life prioritizing the institution over individual sentiment. The monarchy, she argued, could not afford to carry names in its most sacred documents that no longer reflected active participation, loyalty, or alignment with its values. This was not about personal dislike, she said, but about protecting the integrity of royal representation. Charles listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on the document before him. He knew that any such decision would be perceived as personal, regardless of the official reasoning, and he understood the public consequences. Removing Meghan's name was not just an administrative act. It would be read as a verdict on her place in the royal family, a judgment rendered not in words but in deliberate silence. His hesitation was not over whether the decision should be made. That ground had been covered in prior discussions, but over the timing. The family had weathered waves of criticism before, and he was acutely aware of how every move was amplified in the media. The turning point in the meeting came when one of the advisors presented a detailed risk assessment. In it were not only the potential public relations impacts, but also the institutional risks of keeping Meghan's name on the decree. The document argued that her continued inclusion could be seen as contradictory, given her and Harry's increasingly independent public engagements and the narratives they had pursued in interviews and media projects. In the eyes of this assessment, inclusion signaled endorsement, and endorsement carried a cost, and reportedly supported the findings wholeheartedly, pointing to specific instances where Meghan's public statements had been at odds with the monarchy's official positions. In her view, these contradictions were more than inconveniences, they were liabilities. It was at this juncture that the tone of the room shifted from deliberation to resolution. The practical steps were laid out. The removal would be done without fanfare, embedded in the decree without any separate announcement. Those in the room agreed that the absence would speak louder than any public explanation. While the decision was officially justified on procedural grounds, those who know the dynamics of the royal household could see that it was also about drawing boundaries. In the years since Meghan and Harry had stepped back from their royal duties, there had been a persistent tension between the couple's desire to retain certain honors and their willingness to operate outside the conventions that governed the rest of the family. This meeting was, in effect, the palace drawing a clear line on paper, one that could not be blurred by interviews, memoirs, or public appearances. After the main discussion concluded, the group turned briefly to the question of optics. There was agreement that no one from the palace would proactively speak about the change unless asked directly by the press, and even then, the response would be carefully worded to avoid the appearance of personal animosity. The strategy was to let the omission be discovered naturally when the decree was made public. In the modern media landscape, such a discovery was inevitable, and perhaps, in the minds of some, more impactful than a formal statement could ever be. When the meeting adjourned, the draft decree was left on the table for Charles to review once more. He lingered for a moment after the others had departed, his hands resting on the edge of the document. He had been part of countless decisions in his life, many of them difficult, but this one carried an emotional weight he could not entirely set aside. Meghan had been welcomed into the family under the eyes of the world. Now, her official presence was being erased with the quiet stroke of a pen. Outside that room, life at the palace continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Staff went about their duties, tourists gathered beyond the gates, and preparations for upcoming events moved forward. But for those few who had been present, the day marked a decisive turning point. The removal of Meghan's name from the royal decree was more than an isolated administrative change. It was the culmination of months, perhaps years, of gradual distancing, crystallized into a single, irreversible act. And in the weeks that followed, the decision would ripple outward, sparking speculation, fueling headlines, and setting the stage for the public unveiling of the decree. The event in that meeting room was the moment the choice was sealed, but its consequences would reach far beyond the palace walls. It was the pivot point between what had been and what was to come, the instant where the monarchy's course in relation to Meghan Markle shifted permanently. King Charles's dilemma in the days leading up to the signing of the royal decree was far more complex than the final outcome might suggest. To the outside world, he is a monarch with the ultimate authority over such matters, a figure who can simply decide and enact without contest. But in truth, every move he makes is the product of a labyrinth of considerations, political, familial, institutional, and personal. The removal of Meghan Markle's name from a royal decree may have seemed like a straightforward act to those unfamiliar with the inner workings of the monarchy, but for Charles, it was a decision layered with risk and responsibility. From the moment the issue was raised, he was aware that the stakes extended beyond the words on parchment. In the modern era, royal decrees are not merely tools of governance. They are public symbols, dissected by the media, interpreted by royal watchers, and absorbed by millions around the globe as measures of inclusion or rejection. Removing a name was, in essence, making a statement to history itself. This weighed heavily on Charles, who has spent much of his reign trying to position himself as a stabilizing figure after the turbulence of recent years. The political dimension of the dilemma was immediate and unavoidable. As king, Charles presides over a monarchy that is both ancient and evolving. There is pressure from traditionalists within the royal circle to preserve the institution in its purest form, free from the kind of public controversies and media conflicts that have marked Meghan and Harry's departure from senior royal duties. For these voices, the omission of Meghan's name was not only logical but necessary, a reaffirmation of the monarchy's ability to set and enforce its own boundaries. On the other side, there are those who urge adaptation, who believe the monarchy's relevance depends on its ability to reflect modern diversity and maintain ties, however strained, with all branches of the family. Charles understood that either choice risked alienating one of these camps. Then there was the familial aspect, perhaps the most sensitive layer of all. Whatever the political arguments, Meghan is still the wife of his son. Charles knows better than most the weight of estrangement within a family, the way rifts can calcify over time until reconciliation becomes impossible. Removing her name risked further deepening the fracture between Harry and the rest of the family. It could also harden Meghan's public stance against the monarchy, a scenario that could spark new rounds of interviews, revelations, and memoirs, none of which the institution wants. Charles was not blind to the likelihood that such a move might provoke a response, and he knew Harry well enough to expect that any perceived slight would be met with defiance. Beyond these personal and political calculations lay the broader institutional question. What message would this send about the monarchy's own rules? Charles has worked carefully to present himself as a modern king, willing to adjust traditions where necessary, but also capable of enforcing discipline when lines are crossed. Leaving Meghan's name in the decree, despite her absence from official duties, could be interpreted as the monarchy tolerating a level of independence that undermines its structure. Removing it, however, could be interpreted as punitive and out of step with a softer, more reconciliatory public image. It was a choice between appearing too lenient or too severe, with little space in between. Complicating matters further was the role of timing. There were significant royal engagements on the horizon, including high-profile state visits and public ceremonies that would draw global attention. If the omission happened too close to these events, it could overshadow them entirely. If it was delayed, the moment might lose its impact or appear as though the monarchy was hesitating. The decision needed to be executed in a way that maximized control over the narrative while minimizing collateral damage. This kind of precision timing is a hallmark of palace strategy, but in this case, the variables were unusually volatile. In private, Charles was said to have consulted closely with a small circle of advisors he trusted implicitly. These were individuals who had been with him through personal crises, political controversies, and delicate negotiations. They laid out the potential outcomes of both action and inaction. Some argued that removing Meghan's name would demonstrate clarity and resolve, showing the monarchy was not beholden to individuals who chose to operate outside its framework. Others cautioned that the move would be seized upon as confirmation of division within the family, potentially fueling Meghan and Harry's narrative of exclusion and mistreatment. This was the essence of Charles's dilemma. Any path he chose would have consequences he could not entirely control. The monarchy is a carefully maintained balance between symbolism and pragmatism, and decisions that might seem purely administrative often ripple outward into public consciousness in unpredictable ways. Removing a name from a decree might resolve one set of internal concerns, but it could just as easily ignite a fresh wave of controversy in the press, particularly in the hyper-connected digital age where small details are magnified into global talking points. Charles's personal instincts reportedly leaned toward a quiet resolution, making the change without public explanation, allowing the absence to speak for itself. But his awareness of modern media made him cautious. In the current climate, silence is often interpreted as confirmation, and absence can be framed as accusation. He would not be able to rely solely on the public's understanding of tradition. This omission would be analyzed through the lens of every past statement, every public interaction, every rumor and speculation about the royal rift. One of the more difficult elements of the decision was reconciling his own feelings about Meghan with his duty as monarch. Charles has often been described by those close to him as pragmatic but personally sensitive, someone who feels the sting of public criticism but rarely allows it to dictate policy. In Meghan's case, he had once gone to great lengths to welcome her into the family, even walking her down part of the aisle during her wedding when her own father was absent. The memory of that moment still lingered for him, and there was a part of him that regretted how far the relationship had fallen. Yet sentiment could not override what he believed was necessary for the stability of the institution. In the end, his dilemma was resolved not because one side of the argument triumphed over the other, but because he accepted that no outcome would be free of fallout. The monarchy has survived for centuries by making difficult choices, and this, he concluded, was one of them. The decree would go forward without Meghan's name, co-signed by Princess, and to underscore its authority. It was a decision made with the knowledge that it would provoke reaction, but also with the conviction that the institution must assert its own terms. When he finally placed his signature on the document, Charles was not doing so lightly. He understood the gesture would be dissected, criticized, defended, and remembered. He knew it would change the tone of his relationship with Harry, perhaps irreparably. But as king, his role was not to avoid discomfort. It was to act in the interest of the crown, even when that meant weathering the personal cost. And in that quiet moment at the writing desk, with the weight of history in the room, he made the choice that would define yet another chapter in the ongoing story of the House of Windsor. Princess Anne's role in the decision to remove Meghan Markle's name from the royal decree was neither peripheral nor symbolic. It was central, deliberate, and marked by the steady hand of someone who has long understood the mechanics of royal survival. Known throughout her life as the no-nonsense member of the family, and has never been one to engage in theatrics or court public approval. Her focus, unwavering for decades, has always been on the preservation of the monarchy as an institution. In this case, her decision to not only support but co-sign the decree was a decisive signal that the removal was more than a matter of bureaucratic housekeeping. It was an assertion of principle. Anne's position within the royal family gives her a unique kind of authority, one not derived from the throne itself, but from the sheer weight of her service. She has carried out thousands of engagements, many in far less glamorous circumstances than her siblings, and she has built a reputation for diligence, discipline, and a refusal to indulge in self-promotion. This reputation has made her a trusted voice in moments of internal conflict. When Anne speaks in matters of protocol, people listen, not because she seeks to dominate, but because her judgment is rooted in decades of consistent commitment. Those familiar with her style describe her as someone who approaches decisions with an almost military precision. She prefers facts to feelings, precedent to improvisation. In the case of Meghan's name in the decree, and reportedly reviewed previous documents in which members who had stepped back from public duties were either retained or omitted. She examined not just the precedent but the context, who was removed, under what circumstances, and what the impact had been on the monarchy's public perception. From this analysis, she drew the conclusion that Meghan's continued presence in such a formal record was an inconsistency the monarchy could no longer afford. Those close to Harry say he stared at the screen for a long time before speaking. When he finally did, his voice carried that controlled tone he sometimes used in interviews, the one he adopted when he was trying to keep emotion from breaking through. But beneath it was a mixture of disbelief and hurt. He had expected disagreements, even slights, but this was different. This was not a matter of personal interactions or family arguments. This was the monarchy itself, the institution his entire life had been tied to, making a public, official statement that Meghan no longer belonged in its formal narrative. Almost immediately, he began reaching out to a few trusted contacts to confirm what he had seen. He called an old aide who still worked in royal administration, someone who knew the process behind decrees. That conversation reportedly confirmed what he already suspected. Meghan's name had been in earlier drafts. It had been removed deliberately, not as a procedural necessity, but as a conscious decision. This knowledge transformed his initial shock into something more volatile. If she had never been included, the omission might have felt like a technicality. But knowing she had been there, that someone had taken the time to cross her out, made it feel like a direct message. Meghan's emotional response was, by all accounts, quieter but no less intense. She had learned to expect a certain amount of detachment from the institution, but hearing that her name had been purposefully erased from the record still struck her deeply. Harry could see it in the way she moved through the house that night, in the pauses before she answered questions, in the way she kept her phone close but didn't look at it often. She had been prepared for public criticism, but the permanence of an official omission was a different kind of wound. The two of them reportedly spent hours that night discussing what, if anything, they should do in response. There was a temptation to release a statement, to call out the omission, challenge its justification, and frame it as part of a larger pattern of exclusion. But Harry hesitated. He understood that responding too quickly might feed the narrative that the omission was designed to provoke. He also knew that the palace would remain silent, offering no public defense and letting the public draw its own conclusions. By speaking too soon, he risked playing into the palace's hands, confirming their decision as a kind of provocation that had succeeded. Still, the urge to act was strong. Harry felt a responsibility not just to Meghan, but to the image of their shared life. He did not want the omission to stand as the only official record of their position in the royal family. He began considering alternatives. Giving a carefully controlled interview to a sympathetic outlet, releasing new information about their ongoing charitable projects, or even quietly briefing allies in the press to contextualize the omission without tying it directly to their names. These ideas were weighed and set aside, one by one, as the hours passed. In private conversations with friends over the next few days, Harry's tone shifted from reactive to reflective. He began speaking less about the sting of the omission itself and more about what it revealed about the state of the monarchy. For him, the act confirmed that reconciliation, at least in the near term, was no longer a realistic expectation. If the institution could erase Meghan from a decree without warning, it could do the same in other contexts, slowly removing them from the official fabric of royal life until nothing remained but their titles, and perhaps even those were now vulnerable. Reports suggest Harry also placed a call to one of his cousins, someone who had managed to maintain a cordial relationship with both him and the rest of the family. The conversation was, according to a source, measured but telling. Harry asked if the omission had been widely discussed within the family before it happened. The cousin was careful in their answer, suggesting that while the topic had been known to some, it was framed internally as a procedural matter, a way of aligning the decree with current working roles. Harry did not believe that explanation in its entirety, but he understood why it was being offered. Privately, the omission also reignited his concern about the precedent it set for the future. Royal decrees are not just ceremonial. They shape how future historians and archivists understand the relationships and priorities of a given reign. By leaving Meghan's name out now, the monarchy was laying the groundwork for a narrative in which her official connection to the institution had ended far earlier and more decisively than perhaps the public record would otherwise suggest. Harry understood that once this narrative was cemented in the archives, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to challenge. In the days that followed, Harry avoided making public appearances. Friends noted that he seemed more withdrawn than usual, especially when the topic of the decree inevitably arose in casual conversation. Meghan kept her schedule as normal as possible, focusing on upcoming projects, but those around them sensed the shared undercurrent of frustration. They had learned, over time, to expect the palace to act in ways they found exclusionary. But this moment still carried a weight that was different from the everyday frictions. It was not simply an act of distancing. It was a deliberate inscription of that distance into the permanent record of the monarchy. For Harry, the private response was not about plotting revenge or mounting a public counterattack, at least not immediately. It was about processing the reality that the line had now been drawn in a way that could not be erased. It was about reconciling his identity as a son of the king with his role as Meghan's husband, and understanding that in this moment, those identities were not just in conflict. They were mutually exclusive in the eyes of the institution. The omission was both a message and a milestone, and Harry knew that from this point forward, every interaction with his family would be shaped by the shadow it cast. The role of the press in amplifying the story began the moment the omission of Meghan's name was noticed, and from there, the narrative grew larger than the document itself. It started with a handful of royal correspondents who, trained to spot even the smallest deviations in protocol, saw the absence immediately. For them, this was not a minor edit buried in legal language. It was a flashing signal of change within the institution. They moved quickly, drafting short alerts to their editors, framing it as an observation worth pursuing, and within hours, the story had begun its climb up the media ladder. The first outlets to break it were those with dedicated royal desks, broadsheets, and long-established tabloids whose journalists had contacts in both the palace and the wider royal watching community. Their initial reports were restrained, almost clinical, side-by-side excerpts of past and present decrees, a brief explanation of how such documents are normally prepared, and the factual note that Meghan's name was no longer listed. But even these restrained openings carried a subtext that readers and rival outlets picked up immediately. The choice to highlight the change, rather than let it pass without comment, was in itself a form of emphasis. As the hours passed, the coverage began to splinter into different tones and angles. The tabloids moved quickly into emotional territory, leaning into headlines that suggested tension, snubs, and deliberate exclusion. They deployed archival photographs of Meghan at her first royal engagements, juxtaposed with shots of her current life in California, as if to frame the omission as the culmination of a journey from palace halls to independent exile. Television networks followed suit, booking their regular roster of royal commentators to speculate on the motivations behind the change. These appearances were rarely balanced. Each commentator brought their own bias, and the on-air discussions often tipped into veiled accusations or romanticized nostalgia for the working royal days. International outlets, particularly in the United States, approached it from a different perspective. While British coverage often carried an undercurrent of institutional loyalty, American networks tended to focus on Meghan as an individual wronged. Morning talk shows framed the omission as a personal slight, inviting celebrity guests and social commentators to discuss it less as a constitutional matter and more as a family drama. In doing so, they tapped into an audience less invested in royal protocol and more interested in narratives of belonging, rejection, and public image. Social media became the great equalizer in this amplification. Posts from journalists and commentators were clipped, shared, and reframed thousands of times within hours. Hashtags sprang up, some supportive of the monarchy's decision, others defending Meghan and condemning what they saw as a calculated act of erasure. Short video explainers circulated on platforms like TikTok, with users narrating their theories over zoomed-in images of the decree, highlighting the gap where Meghan's name would have been. On Twitter, threads dissected the history of royal decrees, pulling examples from decades past to argue either that the removal was standard procedure or that it was unprecedented. The palace's silence on the matter only heightened the press's role in shaping the narrative. Without an official explanation to temper speculation, journalists filled the void with background context and expert analysis. Former royal press secretaries, some now working as independent consultants, were quoted extensively. They offered polished soundbites about the monarchy's right to determine its own representation, but they also acknowledged, in more candid moments, that the omission would inevitably be interpreted as a deliberate statement. In the editorial sections of newspapers, the story became a canvas for broader commentary. Opinion pieces debated whether the monarchy was adapting to the modern world or retreating into its most rigid traditions. Some columnists argued that the omission was a strategic misstep, alienating younger and more diverse audiences who had once viewed Meghan's entry into the family as a sign of progress. Others saw it as a necessary clarification, a way to preserve the dignity of those who continued to serve as working royals. These opinion pieces often carried more emotional weight than the original reporting, drawing on personal anecdotes, historical parallels, and moral arguments that further inflamed public sentiment. Photographs played a quiet but significant role in the amplification. The images chosen by each outlet subtly shaped the tone of the coverage. Some publications used smiling, regal portraits of Meghan from her earliest days as a duchess, creating a visual reminder of what had been lost. Others selected candid shots from moments of visible tension, a glance caught on camera during a frosty family gathering, or a stiff exchange at a public engagement, to imply that the omission was the inevitable outcome of years of discord. Even the choice of language in headlines influenced the spread of the story. Words like erased, cut, and snubbed carried a far heavier emotional charge than omitted or removed, and those heavier terms were more likely to draw clicks. Tabloids in particular leaned into this, knowing that the emotional framing would not only capture attention but also encourage readers to share the articles, driving the story further into the public consciousness. The feedback loop between the press and the public was in full effect within a day of the decree's release. Media outlets reported the omission. The public reacted online. Journalists wrote follow-up pieces quoting those reactions, and the cycle repeated. Each turn of the loop deepened the story's impact, moving it from a niche observation in royal protocol to a global talking point. This amplification also meant that the omission began to overshadow other royal stories. Engagements that would normally have received moderate coverage, charity visits, ceremonial duties, diplomatic receptions, were either ignored or reframed through the lens of the decree. If Charles or Anne appeared in public, reporters shouted questions about Meghan's omission, even when the event had nothing to do with her. The narrative had taken hold, and the press ensured it stayed in circulation. The ripple effects reached beyond traditional news media. Late-night hosts in the U.S. worked it into their monologues, crafting jokes that, while played for laughs, reinforced the framing of the omission as a deliberate act of exclusion. Influencers and content creators who typically focused on fashion or lifestyle weighed in, often with little regard for the procedural realities, but with a keen sense for what their audiences wanted to hear. The story's reach extended to people who might not have read a single article about royal decrees in their lives, but now felt invested in the drama. In the absence of any public statement from Harry and Meghan during those initial days, the press effectively became the narrator of the event. Each outlet told its version of the story, and each version shaped how millions understood the omission. By the time the couple decided how, or if, they would address it, the narrative had already solidified in the public mind, sculpted by headlines, opinion columns, and viral posts. What was originally a procedural decision captured in a formal document had, through the press's amplification, become a defining moment in the ongoing saga between Meghan and the monarchy. It was no longer just about a missing name. It was about what that missing name represented, and the press made sure the world understood it in the most dramatic terms possible. This conclusion was not born out of a single event, and skepticism toward Meghan's integration into royal life had been quietly evident to those inside the family from the early days. She was not overtly confrontational, but she was observant. She noticed the choices Meghan made in public engagements, the moments when protocol was bent or overlooked, and the interviews in which Meghan's comments diverged sharply from the palace's careful messaging. And these were not just stylistic differences. They were signs of a deeper incompatibility with the expectations of royal service. When the matter of the decree came before her, and viewed it not through the lens of personal grievance, but through the framework of institutional coherence. The monarchy, in her mind, operates best when its members are visibly aligned in purpose and discipline. For someone like Meghan, who had chosen a life outside the working royal structure, the continued formal recognition in such decrees created a blurred message. It suggested an enduring official role that, in Anne's eyes, no longer existed in practice. In private discussions leading up to the decision, Anne was forthright. She argued that the monarchy could not send mixed signals, that those who no longer serve within its framework should not be listed alongside those who carry the weight of its daily obligations. Her position was not about punishment, it was about clarity. By removing Meghan's name, the monarchy would be aligning its formal documents with the reality of its operations. It was, for Anne, a matter of integrity. Her influence in the final decision was reinforced by her willingness to take public responsibility for it. Co-signing the decree was more than a formality. In the intricate world of royal symbolism, it meant lending her personal authority to the choice, making it clear that this was not the unilateral act of the king, nor a move driven solely by palace aides. It was a joint assertion by two senior members of the family who understood both the history and the stakes. This shared authorship gave the decision greater weight and made it far harder for critics to dismiss it as impulsive or politically motivated. Anne's direct involvement also shaped the tone of the removal. Without her, there might have been greater temptation to soften the decision, to find some middle ground that would keep Meghan's name in a reduced capacity or under a qualified title. But Anne's approach left no room for half measures. Once the choice was made, it was to be executed cleanly and without the clutter of explanatory clauses or symbolic gestures meant to soften the blow. In her mind, ambiguity would only invite more speculation, while a clear omission would eventually speak for itself. Her perspective on this issue also drew from her personal experience of being a working royal without the trappings of glamour that often overshadow more ceremonial roles, and has long been aware of the resentment that can build within the family when duties and privileges are unevenly distributed, or when some members reap the benefits of royal status without bearing its burdens. In this case, she saw the continued inclusion of Meghan's name as a potential source of quiet frustration for those still serving. Removing it was, in her eyes, a way of reaffirming respect for the effort and loyalty of the working members. When the day of the signing arrived, Anne's demeanor was as unshakable as ever. She approached the table, reviewed the final draft of the decree with a sharp eye, and signed her name with precise, deliberate strokes. There was no hesitation in her movement, no sign that she viewed the act as anything other than necessary. For those in the room, her presence lent a certain gravity to the moment, a reminder that in the world of the monarchy, duty often demands choices that are unyielding. In the aftermath, and remained silent on the matter, offering no interviews or public commentary. This silence was not avoidance, it was strategy. By refraining from public defense or explanation, she kept the focus on the action itself rather than on her personal reasoning. In doing so, she ensured that the omission of Meghan's name would stand as an institutional decision, not as fodder for personal dispute. Her role in this decision underscores a truth often overlooked about the monarchy's internal workings. Not all influence comes from the throne. Sometimes, it is the steady, consistent voice in the background, the one that has weathered decades of change without losing sight of the core mission, that shapes the course of events most decisively. In this case, Princess Anne's role was exactly that. She was the constant, the enforcer of clarity, the one who ensured that when the ink dried on the royal decree, it reflected the monarchy as it truly stands, not as it once was. The draft that wasn't meant to be seen sat in a plain leather folder, its contents prepared for the king's review by a trusted clerk. In the rigid order of palace administration, every royal decree passes through multiple hands before it reaches the sovereign's desk. It is reviewed, annotated, adjusted, and polished until every word conforms to protocol. Under normal circumstances, the earlier drafts are quietly archived, inaccessible to the public and irrelevant once the final version is signed. But this particular draft carried a detail that, if it ever escaped the safety of palace walls, would have made headlines on its own. Meghan Markle's name, fully present, printed in the same formal style and placement she had always held, only to be later struck through in a deliberate, unmistakable line of ink. The first version of the decree, prepared weeks earlier, had been built on the template of past documents. It included all senior family members connected to the subject at hand, and Meghan's inclusion was automatic, part of the standard list carried forward from earlier years. The clerk who first assembled the draft was following precedent, not politics. For them, Meghan was still a duchess by title and the wife of the king's son. In the absence of specific instruction, her name belonged there. But somewhere between that first draft and the final review, the change occurred. The neat, looping black line that crossed her name wasn't a hurried scribble. It was done with controlled precision, the kind that comes when someone is entirely certain of what they are doing. It wasn't the work of an assistant correcting a typo. This was an intentional deletion, one that removed her not just from a single document, but from the narrative that document carried into the historical record. Sources familiar with the drafting process say the moment the change was made was charged with quiet intensity. The room in which it happened was not filled with chatter. Only 2 senior aides were present, reviewing the document with a senior advisor before it would go to the king. The instruction to remove Meghan's name had already been passed down from higher up, but seeing it executed on paper was a different matter. For those in the room, the act of physically crossing out her name felt like a shift, not the beginning of the decision, but the point at which it became irreversible. What makes this moment significant is that drafts are rarely altered in such a visible way. Normally, changes are made digitally, leaving no trace of what was once there. But in this case, the removal was done on a physical copy, with a pen, in a way that left behind a ghost of what had been erased. Whether that was a simple matter of process or a symbolic choice is unclear. What is certain is that this draft, the one showing her name and its removal, became a tightly guarded piece of paper, handled by as few people as possible from that point forward. When Prince Harry learned about the draft, it was not through official channels. Someone with knowledge of the process quietly let him know that his wife's name had originally been included and then crossed out. The news reportedly hit him with a force he had not anticipated. He had expected the final decree might omit her name, given the state of relations with the family, but hearing that she had been there in the beginning, only to be deliberately removed, made it feel personal in a way that a simple omission never could. It wasn't an oversight, it was a decision. Harry's reaction, according to those close to him, was a mix of anger and resignation. He had fought battles within the family before, but this one felt different. This wasn't about an argument in a meeting or a disagreement over a speech. This was about the monarchy making a formal, historical statement that would stand for generations. A royal decree is not a press headline that fades in a week. It is part of the record, as permanent as the pages in the royal archives. The draft itself became an object of near paranoia within the palace. It was kept in a secure file, its access limited to those with the highest clearance. Even then, there were whispered concerns about whether a photograph of it might leak. The image of Meghan's name, cleanly printed alongside other royals, and then crossed out with a single, unbroken stroke, would have been explosive if it reached the press before the official signing. It would strip away any ability the palace had to frame the omission as a procedural matter. It would reveal the act for what it was, a conscious choice, carried out in ink before the king's eyes. There is a certain irony in the fact that this draft, never meant for public view, may be the most revealing artifact of the entire episode. It tells a story that no press release or official statement could. It shows that the decision was not a foregone conclusion from the outset, that Meghan's presence in the decree was the default until someone in the chain of authority decided otherwise. It speaks to a moment in time when there was still a version of the royal record that included her, a version that could have been signed, sealed, and preserved without controversy. And it shows how quickly such a version can be rewritten. In the days that followed, those involved in the drafting process took care to ensure the final document carried no trace of the earlier inclusion. By the time the decree was read aloud and photographed, there was nothing to suggest Meghan had ever been part of it. For the public, the absence was simply an absence. For those who had seen the earlier draft, it was a silence that carried the echo of her erased name. What lingers about this moment is the human element. On the surface, it is a procedural step, one of countless edits made to official documents in the palace every year. But beneath that, it is an act of deliberate exclusion, carried out not in the heat of public confrontation, but in the quiet, methodical way that the monarchy makes its most enduring statements. It is a reminder that the real turning points often happen far from the cameras, in rooms where the only witnesses are a handful of people, a stack of papers, and the quiet scratch of a pen striking through a name. Public reaction to the decree was swift, layered, and deeply polarized. The first wave of awareness came not through an official palace announcement, but through the quiet observations of seasoned royal correspondents who had learned to scan every royal document with almost forensic attention. The decree was released in the standard way, published for public record and circulated to the press, but it did not take long for someone to notice what was missing. Within hours of its publication, side-by-side comparisons of the new document and past decrees began appearing online. In one column, the older versions where Meghan's name appeared alongside other senior royals. In the other, the newly issued decree, her absence a stark gap in the flow of names. The earliest reactions were tinged with disbelief. Some supporters of Meghan wondered if it was a printing error, an oversight that would be corrected with a quiet amendment. Others, more familiar with the meticulous nature of royal documentation, knew at once that this was no mistake. The monarchy does not misplace names in decrees. If her name was missing, it was missing by design. That realization changed the tone of the conversation almost instantly, moving it from speculation about logistics to speculation about intent. In the United Kingdom, the morning talk shows seized on the development with an eagerness that hinted at the audience's appetite for royal drama. Hosts leaned forward in their seats, emphasizing the gravity of the omission, and invited experts to discuss what it signaled about Meghan's standing with the family. Former palace aides, now media commentators, explained the symbolic weight of being named in such decrees, framing Meghan's removal as both an institutional correction and a deeply personal exclusion. For royal supporters loyal to the crown, the omission was seen as overdue. In their view, Meghan's decision to step away from official duties and pursue a separate public life made her continued inclusion inconsistent. Social media accounts aligned with pro-monarchy sentiment framed the change as the royal family reclaiming control over its own image, putting duty above personal relationships. To them, the removal was not an act of spite, but an act of housekeeping, a necessary step to align the official record with reality. Among Meghan's global fan base, however, the news was received with outrage. Prominent voices in the media, particularly in the United States, cast the omission as a calculated snub, an unnecessary escalation in what they saw as an ongoing campaign to marginalize her. Hashtags began trending within hours. Some called for solidarity with Meghan, while others urged boycotts of royal events or questioned the monarchy's relevance in the modern era. For these supporters, the removal was not simply administrative. It was proof of institutional rejection, a deliberate act to write her out of history. The international reaction was just as divided. In Commonwealth countries where debates over the monarchy's role are already active, the omission reignited discussions about whether the institution still represented the diverse populations it claimed to serve. Some commentators argued that removing Meghan's name sent a message of exclusion to people who had once seen her as a symbol of progress within the royal family. Others countered that the monarchy had always been selective in its representation, and that this was simply another example of the crown protecting its own narrative. News outlets quickly filled the airwaves and websites with analysis. Photographs from Meghan's early days in the family were juxtaposed with images of her post-royal life, as if to visually chart the arc from inclusion to exclusion. Timelines of key events were published, mapping every public rift, every statement, every symbolic moment that had led to this point. The omission became the latest chapter in an ongoing saga, one that seemed to bridge personal grievance and institutional discipline. Social media amplified the reaction in ways the palace could neither predict nor control. Videos of news anchors announcing the omission went viral, spliced together with clips from Meghan and Harry's past interviews, edited to suggest a narrative of betrayal. Supporters and critics alike shared their interpretations, often talking past each other, each side certain of the motives behind the decision. The speed of this amplification made the story inescapable, ensuring that even those indifferent to royal affairs encountered it in their feeds. In the days following the decree's release, the public reaction began to evolve from shock to dissection. People debated not only the symbolism of the omission, but also its practical implications. Would this lead to changes in Meghan's remaining royal titles? Could it affect Harry's standing within the family? Was it the first move in a broader reorganization of the royal household? The absence of an official explanation from the palace left room for all possibilities, and into that space poured speculation, both informed and fantastical. For those who admired Meghan, the reaction was deeply personal. They spoke of betrayal, of a woman welcomed with open arms into the family, only to be pushed aside when she no longer fit the mold. Supporters highlighted her charitable work, her speeches, and her moments of connection with the public as evidence that she had earned her place in such decrees, regardless of her current role. Critics, however, pointed to the couple's public criticism of the institution as justification for the removal, framing it as the natural consequence of their own choices. The palace, for its part, maintained silence. In previous decades, such silence might have quelled the storm, allowing public attention to shift elsewhere. But in the modern media landscape, silence was interpreted as confirmation. The lack of explanation became its own story, fueling the idea that the omission was too deliberate to be anything other than a pointed statement. Royal correspondents noted that by saying nothing, the palace allowed the omission to carry its full symbolic weight without being diluted by an official narrative. Public reaction was not limited to commentary alone. In some circles, it inspired action. Meghan's supporters organized online campaigns to promote her charitable endeavors, framing them as a counterpoint to her exclusion from the royal record. Petitions circulated calling for her reinstatement in future decrees, though those familiar with royal procedure knew such reversals were virtually unheard of. Meanwhile, critics used the moment to argue for stricter definitions of who should be recognized in official royal documents, suggesting that only those actively serving the crown should be named. What became clear in the weeks after the decree was that this was not a fleeting news cycle story. It tapped into deeper currents of public opinion about the monarchy itself, its inclusivity, its adaptability, and its willingness to embrace or reject those who step outside its traditional bounds. Whether people saw the omission as justice or injustice, few saw it as meaningless. It had touched a nerve, becoming yet another marker in the long, complicated history between Meghan Markle and the institution she once called her family. Harry's private response to the omission of Meghan's name from the royal decree unfolded far from the public eye. but those close to him describe it as a moment of deep emotional turbulence. It wasn't the kind of anger that bursts and fades quickly. It was the kind that arrives in waves, each one bringing a fresh realization of what the omission truly meant. Harry had long anticipated that relations with his family might reach this kind of fracture, yet when it came, the reality carried a sting he hadn't fully braced for. The royal decree was not just another headline or tabloid rumor. It was an official act, a piece of history that would outlast them all, preserved in archives long after every current player in the drama was gone. The news reached him, according to sources in his circle, late in the evening in Montecito. The first he heard of it wasn't through a formal palace communication. That courtesy had not been extended, but through a journalist friend who had been scanning the newly released decree. They messaged him a link, along with a short note that made it clear what they'd found. At first, Harry thought it was an exaggeration or perhaps a misunderstanding of the document's format. But as he read it for himself, the absence became glaringly obvious. It was as though the space where Meghan's name should